Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are doing loot research for our loot bot, which is already doing pretty good. If you would like to join us at all, this is, as always, an Atlantic Rim, basically, style lobby. If you're in the Midwest of the US, you may be able to connect to everyone properly. But East Coast, Caribbean, West Coast of Europe, possibly a little past that. Today Omni Rabbit will be playing Luke, mainly because that's the person with the closest character style otherwise. We've done minor testing on LukeBot, but most of the people you're going to see as opponents here are not actually in possession of LukeBot yet. So we're going to be getting information on first order strategies from both sides here. We may have to rethink the entire bot, honestly, because at the moment we're building Luke based on what it seems that Capcom meant for Luke to do in neutral, and you know, when he's not just piling on damage with his special abilities. Mostly knockdowns, specific special types of Oki, and positioning after certain moves that seem to leave him advantaged enough that he'll get something. This is, however, day one Luke. For a person who has basically only played the character for maybe an hour. But with the strategy in mind, and with the explicit intention of reacting somewhat emotionally to what is happening and just trying stuff out, we should be able to push forward through that. So once again, feel free to join us if you want to play Luke or if you want to fight Luke. But we're going into Luke versus Necalli, a matchup which theoretically so far has seemed to be in Luke's favor somewhat. Since one of Necalli's strengths is basically the ability to push people back out far enough that they are disadvantaged. But so far from all our measurements, it's not Necalli that's going to end up at a disadvantage in that spacing. Which is technically useful, as it gives Omni Rabbit time to lean into getting control of this character. And therefore gives the Wolf time to adapt as the building skills on Omni's side come in. So far, most of our data indicates that Luke doesn't exactly have the greatest of normals in terms of getting pressure on people. Even his stand light punch is -4, presumably to prevent a certain tick throw setup. And despite having good specials, it's not exactly easy to make use of them without getting hit out of them in some way.
Final round.
I really tried to capture it, huh? Alright. The strengths in neutral aren't bad though. Despite having so few ways to actually get pressure off of those activities, the medium kick is really nice and annoying. And his crouch light kick is plus, so you do have a lot of positions you can get, as well as a good cross-up jump medium kick that tends to lead into other stuff quite well. having crouch medium punch as the main punish is going to be fairly easy for people. But the main thing that is complicated about this character, and we're already beginning to think about it in terms of whether or not Capcom intended to do this for some sort of test for Street Fighter 6, is that Luke's V meter goes up when he does damage other than by the specials that consume it, and goes down when he takes damage. And honestly, it doesn't drift or move all that quickly either way, so he has a very heavy strategic aspect to play if you can get through it. His V reversal is pretty good as well, but it means he has the potential to spend a lot of time in the V trigger state. There you see one of his better options. If he can manage to distress you in neutral enough with just the jabs, the heavy punch, and the medium kick, he'll get the throw. And once he has the throw, he seems to have things that definitely could be annoying, even if they're the style of thing that you can always see coming and just use invincible moves against. However, as he has quite high health and stun, he honestly could be one of those characters that you're just supposed to take it. Sometimes you just let the other person do their ES wake up. Intentionally take that hit because you're going to get so much out of it otherwise. This is particularly true when he doesn't have his V trigger active yet, but is close, because it's not terribly hard to get V meter with his V skill. Both of them are pretty good at dealing with that sort of thing, as demonstrated there. If you attempt to throw him, his V skill 2 will basically just beat you. And while the move is not naturally great, it gets better when that's the case. He also gets a lot of good cancels off of the moves he otherwise wouldn't want to use in neutral. So both as Luke players and playing against Luke, you have to be really good at hit confirming, or things are just not going to work out.
Luke wins. It's go time.
And we're just dropping to back because, in this case, this is warm-up time. Because Nakali often relies on the spacing for people's projectiles to know whether or not to do disc guidance, Luke, whose Sand Blaster basically just bursts out, can be a little hard to deal with. We thought that this character was going to be overwhelming in that regard, but honestly it's not terribly different from having to face Dalsim. The difference being mainly that you can, if you practice really long, learn to counter Dalsim's outstretched limbs. But it technically is harder to get in on Dalsim with that sort of thing than it is to get in on Luke. So you should mainly be thinking about whether or not it's a good idea for your opponent to be throwing the Sand Blaster at that time.
Really want to go through the trouble? Fine.
Basically, if you spend that amount of time thinking about it in the Dalsim matchup, just apply it to this one as well.
Round one.
This exactly is the sort of situation I'm talking about. Luke has a lot of health, would basically get one more hit a moment ago that is, and would have had the trigger active, which isn't what happened, but taking the EX move at that point wouldn't have been terrible. It does depend on your opponent and what their EX leads into, but in Akali's case, you definitely want to just let yourself get hit by it sometimes, if it will set up a better situation for you. If your opponent starts to play too defensively, then you get to see that move a lot. Generally it's not so great, but if given enough time to charge, or even just being at the right spacing, it's at least not disadvantaged enough to be a real problem. Which is useful because an opponent who plays too defensively against Luke, sure they can't do a lot, but he doesn't really get to do much of his natural game plan either, so far as what we understand it to be. This is somewhat necessary for Akali because if Akali attempts to move forward too much, he'll probably face the same fate he does against Karin, get jumped on. But, as you can see, Luke's ability to cover all that space in front of him can end up being surprising to Akali, who has similar attacks but basically doesn't move that far forward. Or, the timings at which the attacks move forward probably just lose to Luke's movement naturally through rhythm. Akali's best option here is probably to use a lot of crouching medium kick, but we haven't necessarily seen that in action yet, or had a really good reason to believe it'll help a lot. It's simply a matter that the space Luke controls is a space Akali often needs but can't easily get in this one. Fortunately, most of Luke's better long-range moves don't actually hit quite low enough, or rather mid enough, that you can be certain that Akali won't get away with it. So, crouch medium kick as a generality should help out somewhat. We are already seeing it play out though. The spaces that Akali is able to put Luke at aren't disadvantageous to Luke.
Sucks to be you. And now I beat ya.
Round 2. Fight.
This could be a situation where Akali is the one who needs to jump in weird scenarios, but I don't think it would actually turn out all that good if he were to do so. Luke is one of those characters where the forward movement could cause even your cross-ups to miss. If the Luke player has chosen to go for something that they think is going to catch a backdash, or that you just aren't going to block. One of the few times where you actually end up getting hit by that.
Final round. Fight.
One of the most fortunate things is that a lot of Luke's moves are in fact interruptible in some way, so you won't spend too much time having to take a ton of damage from this character rushing in at you if you are actually willing to hit a button and are basically fast enough to recognize what's going on. Or, you know, mashing. of the things the bot is going to incorporate, regardless of whether or not we change it, is the ability to V-shift out of what Luke does have that seems like pressure. Since the character isn't likely to use a lot of strong pressure, it generally means that most people, at least trying to get used to him, are more likely to try harder when they have the option for it. But because his moves tend to continue forward, sometimes this means that your V reversal won't be the best idea. But there are less situations in which V shifting isn't a good idea. There are definitely some, but those force the Luke player to give up a lot of their own offense in that moment anyway.
Round 2. Fight.
Probably one of the easier ways to actually get the throw using this character would be to empty jump over someone's head after landing a specific attack type. In fact, most combos that involve landing Sandblaster will let you jump almost immediately after them, and force your opponent into at least a difficult anti-air. It depends on their character, of course. This more so applies to the combo versions than the regular ones.
Final round. Fight.
One of the other ways to get it is obviously to whiff one of those moves. And as you can see, just end up in that space.
Luke wins.
From Akuma's side, this matchup is likely to be a little bit easier to understand, just harder to actually do. Since Luke's projectiles generally can't be parried as easily, can't be hit by Demon Flip Punch as easily, and can be done from far enough away that just doing a Demon Flip over them and then letting it drop and do the kick still may not work, Akuma doesn't have a lot of strong approaches in the matchup. However, the fact that Luke's anti-air uppercut style moves cover so much space means that jumping, just jumping, isn't likely to be a lot of help either. This is mostly therefore going to come down to, similar to the Seth matchup, what is the interaction between most of Luke's moves and Tatsu? And so far we don't actually know this because we haven't done any Akuma tests yet. And even if we did, on the bot it's not always clear when something has done the correct thing because of the spaces people tend to occupy. Having the red fireball is a strong help here, but Luke can see that coming and jump over it another way. So, in the end, it's going to be very much about perfectly spaced Tatsus and timings based on those Tatsus. Fortunately, the Demon Flip can be used in a completely anticipation style. And you can obviously parry Luke relatively easily in closer combat where the Sandblaster won't help anymore. Even if you were to use it, you'd still end up getting parried. Akuma's parry tends to reach a lot further forward than you'd immediately think. So once Akuma is close, parrying tends to work better. Once Akuma is far away, you have to decide a lot more what you're going to be doing. Fortunately, as you can see here, punches have a lot better spacing against Luke's buttons than Nakali can easily muster, for example. Meaning that Luke has to resort back to mostly the stand medium kick. Well, given the range of his crouch medium punch and that it is his punish button, it doesn't really look as if the Tatsu is going to help a lot if it gets blocked. There are certain characters where the payoff is just so large that you might as well do it. But as your opponents get better, this becomes less and less useful, obviously. Still, it does serve its main purpose. Using it makes Luke defensive, and if Luke becomes defensive, then you can set up other things. One place it's likely to come in more handy is just trying to move in from really long ranges. If one finds oneself far enough away and having to chase Luke, light and medium Tatsu are probably decent mobility tools instead.
Luke wins.
Once Akuma does get up to the V-trigger state, any chance at activating it is likely to lead to stronger situations overall simply because of the ability to do Demon Flip into Fireball and other Fireball shenanigans as a generality. Luke has very little against these moves besides the uppercut. However, the disparity in levels of health between these characters are going to make things harder for many Akuma players, simply because Luke can afford to just play this match fairly defensively.
Round 2. Fight.
Since Akuma's V skills generally don't lead to Akuma getting enough V meter without taking enough damage. And this is not a character where you get to land crush counters constantly. At least not without risking some fairly messed up setups happening to you. Note again, during this interaction is probably a good time to note it, Luke's V trigger gauge going up and down based on damage taken or dealt, which makes this matchup technically even harder for Akuma because though Akuma can obviously deal explosive damage and take out the rest of the V gauge, when Luke is on the offensive and Akuma is basically stuck unable to do much, the V trigger meter doesn't really need to be used up to keep it going. It's only when the two characters are relatively far apart. So Akuma generally should have to put some distance there, probably. Well, there's sign number one that the Tatsu is going to work only in very specific situations. Still, it's a question between that and dashing against a character who is probably among the best for checking dashes in this game. And unlike most other zoners where, well, I'm throwing out the fireball against Akuma's red fireball as a loss, Luke doesn't suffer from that. We can probably see some benefit from the instant air fireball itself, but it's likely to end up in the same scenario. There are times where it's useful, but more so as a shield to get closer. And if Akuma spends too much time playing the shield to get closer game, it's going to be too difficult to use meter for damage correctly. Of course, this is all basically again day one, and we'll have lots to think about based on whatever pops up on Twitter.
Let's do this.
So, you really want to go through the trouble? Fine.
Round one.
Beat ya!
Round 2. Fight.
Hey! This'll hurt! Hey! Nowhere to run! Take that! Rising upper! Too bad! Hey!
Final round. Fight.
Too bad! Nowhere to run! Rising upper!
Nekali wins.
You gave him braces, Capcom. Really? Fine.
Round 1. Fight.
Playing this character well seems like it's going to rely a lot on your understanding of the rhythm and flow of a battle. Is your opponent retreating or coming forward? Are they thinking about offense or basically going to sit there while you charge a move that will let you move across the screen at them?
Round 2. Fight.
It's a very different type of fundamentals. Similarly, it involves really working a lot on reading, is the opponent actually going to hit me? And this, probably for one of the few characters in this game, comes from an offensive perspective. If I do this move, and I miss, like I purposely whiff it, will my opponent actually hit me with whatever they're likely to respond with? Fortunately, Luke has a lot of relatively far-reaching faster moves to prevent that from happening, which opens up a decent number of options. And since you can't just neutral jump to solve the problem once V-Trigger 1 is active, you'll see this sort of thing a lot. As of now, the plan is to have the bot function with this exact V skill and V trigger, which is why we're gathering information from these specifically.
Round 1.
Though we do intend to test out what it's like when the other ones are active. So far, the design principles don't have that as the goal. We can already see Omni Rabbit learning more or less the range at which to jump after Sandblaster. There are certain times where you'd want to do it simply because your opponent's best counters are weak, and then there are other even better positions where you jump because your opponent has no good counters at all. They can basically get out of the way or not, similar to how Kage tends to make things work. Players who attempt to deal with this preemptively will often find themselves on the receiving end of an uppercut.
Round 2. Fight.
Fortunately for Necalli, Luke is in a very similar situation. The uppercut Luke uses doesn't necessarily deal that well with cross-ups. You would have to actually learn the cross-cut, and it won't just catch people who are jumping over your head from a certain range anyway. Here we see the use of EX meter to regain V meter. And maintain the space required so that there's just no way in.
Luke wins.
Necalli isn't even really in a position where just going, I'm going to walk you down, is an option either.
It's go time. Let's do this.
So while it's so far been difficult to discern a specific first order style strategy for the character simply because there's no obvious I have control of this situation now setup, that could simply be because, again, day one, and Omni Rabbit hasn't had time to learn the specific timings for his shoulder tackle to get plus frames on it. That, however, is not something we're desperately trying to get data on because it's too easy to just look on Twitter when someone has found ridiculous setups of some kind. So, we're back to thinking about how can you make the bot function in neutral. Akuma's not a character where you're likely to get away with the whole I am attacking from full screen with this move thing, simply because he doesn't care enough. But mid-screen stuff, particularly walking back just out of the range of everything else and actually landing Sandblaster, seems as if it will be a strong option.
I'll never lose to anyone!
Round 2. Fight.
One thing that the air fireball is definitely capable of giving Akuma in this matchup is the spacing to get into position to attempt to parry in the first place. And because it will probably cause at least some players to look for it, there will be more chances.
Luke wins. Round one. Fight.
Therefore, once placed at the longer range, Akuma can use various methods to get into position, but it's going to be the same sort of thing. Rhythm of the match is going to matter a lot more than the properties of any given move. This is helped along by the simple fact that so many of Luke's moves move forward that it's possible for Akuma to get better with punishes.
Round two. Fight.
One of the main reasons we expect the parry to become such a serious part of this matchup is because of how much the offense portion of it changes for Akuma once the V-trigger is possible. As we mentioned before, Luke definitely has answers to that happening, but they're just not the sort of thing you can do quickly enough. So much of this comes down to that aspect of it. By how much does Akuma have the meter advantage? Activating V-trigger at the pretty much exact moment when Luke has used up all of his own meter, I won't call it a guaranteed victory, but it will definitely make things hard enough for Luke's side that at the mid to low levels, you're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about it from the Luke side. Fortunately, you do get something out of this. As mentioned, Luke has a lot of health, and it makes it easier to interact at close range, even against a powerhouse like Akuma, because you end up with that situation. Any other character, well, not any other, but most other characters of this style would not still be standing.
Let's do this.
we are in fact going to actually get Falk. This matchup should be relatively good for her, as she can just go under most of the things Luke wants to do. However, we have tested, and Luke's charge into, for example, the overhead, while being very minus, is a good thing to use when Falk doesn't have meter yet.
So, you really want to go
Not
through the
just
trouble?
use it right away, obviously. You know, just play around in neutral without doing too much.
Let's begin.
And see if you can find the way in to get the advantage given. Mainly though, her options make Luke's life somewhat harder than most characters. As he has no really good attack for right over his head, he's going to have to rely on damage quite a lot in this matchup.
Sucks to be you, and now I beat ya.
Round 2. Fight.
This is another one of those situations where rhythm is going to matter a lot. In the sense of the sort of thing that happens when you're trying to face a character that throws projectiles and you must neutral jump one of them or they'll just keep on doing it forever. It's not exactly that, though that would probably help somewhat. One important thing though is that Falk's projectiles are almost always single hit, and Luke's EX charge is armored, at least one hit worth. So you always have at least some minor option to get in. Unfortunately, the way this armor works doesn't usually lead to him getting a lot out of it. But it is a good way to get to at least that far. You can relatively surely get in. Not necessarily in that situation when Falk is sitting on full meter, but it's still a thing you can do at different parts of the match. Interestingly, one of the most powerful options Luke would probably have in this matchup is a neutral jump, simply because most of Falk's game plan strategy doesn't defeat it. It allows him more time to set up Sandblaster in various forms. And of course, you can just, as demonstrated there, just jump on her, because she must use the fireball in the way that you see there.
It's not done. Handle this.
Unlike many characters where jumping is about trying to actually hit Falk, Luke doesn't care about this. Luke just doesn't want to be that far away anymore.
Round 1.
So, we find ourselves in a situation that almost always comes up with first order strategy setups. The opponent has a thing that prevents you from doing one of your own strategies, and you have to get used to the idea that that thing, as long as they continue to do it, allows for another one that is usually worse.
What to do?
Once this situation comes up though, I'm not sure Falk has a lot of good options. Luke can stand too far away and just annoy her outright. His spacing also allows him to get away with a lot more than most other characters can. main thing that will make this playable
You wouldn't let me have the easy way.
is to not activate V-trigger at all once Falk is in the corner. Simply because the V-shift is a much easier way to control where she is. In fact, if one can get Falk to corner while having enough meter to do anything, generally she'll be stuck there, and she'll be stuck there in a relatively bad way. Because Luke's corner guard against this character is relatively strong. He doesn't even really need to pressure. V-shifting that situation, for example, will always put him in a spacing where he can decide what to do next at least. And while it means, yes, Falk is managing to get Luke to waste V-meter, Luke doesn't appear to need V-meter for anything else in this matchup. Since his uppercut is also executable out of the V-shift before she even lands, there's not a lot that is a good idea to do here. Of course, that involves being able to V-shift into uppercut, which is not something that this player has ever had a reason to train ever. Still, it is a valid option. In this case, therefore, burning out this gauge quickly is probably better. And our Falk player responds by knowing that's what's supposed to happen and immediately going on the offense because that's where things are going to be better.
Falk wins.
So we did get to see Falk be pushed to a strategy that was more so a counter to the player than the character, which is probably good.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Well, since our active Luke is at the moment taking a break, and the fact that our usual discussion of this matchup tends to talk about things that don't apply to these two players. Oh, good, never mind. As soon as I see them switch to Mika, I know that the matchup is going to be much, much more complex. The main thing our Nakali needs to do in most matchups with this style of Mika is to forward jump when they're close and neutral jump when they're far. That's more or less all you need to do, because anything else will probably get you caught by their various movement setups.
Round one.
So this, for example, is a forward jump or uppercut situation, whereas that is a neutral jump situation. Obviously, recognizing when to use each of those on short notice is the challenge here. The Mika player needs to be more active in order to prevent Nakali from being able to quickly decide which thing to do. but being more active makes her more susceptible to the neutral jump in the first place. You can see a lot of situations here where the forward jump leads to them being out of sync, and that, on the other hand, leads directly to damage. Good choice though. I think you can react to that by doing Nakali's super, but I'm not absolutely sure because I think hers starts up slightly slower than Zangief's does. If it is Zangief you're up against, you can't do anything, you just are hit already.
Round one. Fight.
But we've already seen at least a positive change with there, and a new one actually. It's not that Mika has no options for this, it's again that this style of play, if used correctly, forces Mika to play differently, and that's what you mainly want. She must either play more defensively or occupy a different space, both of which favor Nakali quite heavily. Of course, she can also just get close and make it so Nakali should jump over her head, or fake the player out into thinking that she's going to get that close and then do it anyway. There's another good option. Patience until you see Nakali actually do the neutral jump, and then attempt the charge dropkick. But this has a lot of problems. Mainly because the thing the charge dropkick is normally relying on is being able to do stuff after it. Nakali will normally manage to block. And that means you're facing a character that has both an EX uppercut and a command grab. But that is no different from the mix-up in any other situation where she is able to do this long enough. So, it's still a good option for her to take. It just changes that move from a tool that she can easily use for straight offense into one that she must use reactively while waiting for someone to try to counter. Again, changing the style of play she's using, not necessarily the actual attacks. Good space setup there. But the neutral jump once again does its job, and it increases the chances of that happening. To do all of this while still having enough awareness to actually do the anti-airs might be a little straining on DeWolf at this point, but it doesn't seem to be overwhelmingly so. For most characters without uppercuts, these work better because using max range blocked hits from Mika's side is just a stronger tactic. But Nakali can just uppercut out of these things, and with so much low invincibility on certain of those uppercuts, Mika's primary good, hey I've hit you and now I'm doing more things buttons, i.e. low kick, aren't necessarily going to help as much. One of the good parts of doing this is precisely this way, is that it opens up the option to jump forward at timings where the opponent is expecting you to just want to neutral jump. And because they're expecting the neutral jump, different reactions tend to happen, making it easier to land stuff off of the forward jump, particularly because they'll tend to be cross-ups.
Round 2. Fight.
So a successful change in both players' styles. Basically, are Nakali playing correctly enough to bake the Mika move to the next level strategy, and the Mika player having the next level strategy available and immediately understanding this is how I need to change, and then I'll go back to being effective, which is what you're seeing now. This is generally one of the higher goals you're aiming for at the beginning of your Street Fighter time. To just make your opponent do something different. Those who don't know the something different will lose, and those who know it will probably beat you still, but at least you will have forced them to change and learned how to deal with the next thing. That's the dance. Just out of position, but barely enough health to make that not terrible. Ah, couldn't get the conversion. Wait, does that even convert? I don't think it does. I'm thinking of a different character.
Let's do this.
Here we have another matchup where it actually plays out very similarly now that I think about it. Akuma can mostly deal with Falk by using the correct spacing, timing, height with the air fireball from reasonably far away rather than just trying to get in. This is because it has the downward trajectory. It will hit her in a lot of situations even though she crouches. The main thing though is that unlike Luke, who doesn't want to play the fireball game at all because of the way that the fireball interacts, Akuma can definitely get away with doing it. Akuma can throw regular fireballs at specific times simply because Falk can't spend literally all her time using the ground shot. She will die in some other way. Which, of course, would explain why we moved to Manat. Manat has a much better matchup here, if that's the main strategy to be used, because she has the reflect. She can deal with all of Akuma's projectiles instead of just one at a time. What she does not deal with well is light demon flip that is, in 2 punches. Mainly because she just can't, she has no actual counter to this if she's far away. Fortunately, they did make sure that her uppercut soul grab style attack does something useful, but because Akuma can often use both the forward heavy punch and the light demon flip, she must play very defensively, watching for those moves. And having to watch for those moves means she has to move a lot slower. Once Manat has been forced to move slower, it's a little bit easier for Akuma to do all sorts of things. And as you can see here, it prevents Akuma from having to deal with basically any of her neutral. That was unlucky. The neutral jump you see there is not actually a solution to the problem. It mainly becomes one both in the corner and at that specific timing.
Round 2.
So overall, this is going fairly well so far. And we see another issue with the general usage of flow to make the opponent think, okay, you have to try to zone me, that's what we're doing now, and then beating this out by correctly timing a response to that. But of course it doesn't stand the test of solving the overall neutral problem of having a character who is almost never in range where you can actually hit them. The one thing Minot loses by moving into that range is her ability to actually reflect the projectile in time. She can, however, still slide under them. The slide is a generally bad idea because if Akuma is blocking, then nothing really happens.
Round 1. Fight.
See it demonstrated there. There is a very specific range at which you're basically going, either I'm going to light demon flip you or I'm going to throw a fireball. And you have to figure out which one is going to happen in a very short space of time. This is mainly because the way that Minot recovers from throwing out normals meant to stop Akuma from doing things tends to lose to Akuma's fireballs. Forward heavy punch can also help, but the problem with the forward heavy punch is that the timing is very difficult. That one looked like it was a little bit too far out. And they dropped their combo. And another combo.
Minot wins. Let's do this.
Kazuki Dynasty has already had some time with the Luke bot. Enough of it and enough understanding of it just from quick interactions that it's not likely to go super well on OmniRabbit's side without even more of a warm-up. When you are very used to how bots function, they can enable you to defeat players working through day one stuff with your main character because it's your main character. You know what you're doing already. The only thing you're working out is which tool for which situation, and that is of course what exactly the bot is for.
So, you really want to go through the trouble? Fine.
But we are now back to Nakali's Great Challenge. Jumping more definitely helps, but that has more so to do with the player than the character, since most of this can be uppercut, and more jumping just makes the opponent think you're going to jump more. Luke's uppercuts are all air invincible because, I don't know, fairness was a thing that Capcom decided was not necessary anymore. Or maybe they think that's how it's always going to be because they're uppercuts. I mean, why not? a demonstration of the situation where one doesn't get hit. That's actually a very difficult to explain interaction, but I'll try. When you intend to jump to hit Necalli after he's done Crawling Beast, you generally should hit the attack you have that you feel has the longest possible hit stun. Most of the time it's not going to matter in the sense of which button should I hit at all, because almost all of the time your heavy buttons also have the range required to do the job. You might be used to getting things done with your mediums if you have certain good medium kicks, and a couple of characters like Sakura who probably have to at least consider whether or not their heavy kick is a good idea. But in general, the longer the hit stun on the attack you use to hit Necalli when getting over a Crawling Beast, the higher the chance that you won't be hit by the Crawling Beast itself when you land. For various other reasons, it tends to be better to use your heavy punch than to use your heavy kick, but this isn't true for every character, so test it out on your own. And if you can't manage because the bot doesn't do it well enough, or you don't really know, there's always Necalli players here every Monday. At least one of whom is quite comfortable using that move.
Luke wins.
I am of course here still thinking of ways to help our Necalli player make this not a bad matchup. And again, it might not actually be one. This is just first order strategies seem to be such that it's bad for Necalli, and I haven't figured out anything better yet. We do know that based on the flows, the crouch medium kick does help. While the Luke does have responses, they don't seem to be terribly stressful to Necalli. But it's definitely true, and in fact partially has been one of the reasons I think why higher level players don't use this character as much other than Matchable, because Matchable is terrifying. When Necalli doesn't have that advantage of getting people out of position, it's a lot harder to make real progress with him in this sort of matchup. What you can see though is the standard for this character. Explosive damage potential. The question is, can you realize that damage potential without your opponent clipping you to death?
Round 2. Fight.
One of Necalli's greatest strengths in standard situations, especially when fighting defensive opponents, is that he will build up a lot of meter through just standard interactions and never need to use it for pretty much anything. An opponent who isn't trying to get closer, or doesn't suddenly take their turn and force you to block for 30 seconds, is not someone against whom you need to keep your own turn. So the solution is basically what you just saw.
Final round. Fight.
Unfortunately here, there's simply not enough damage.
Luke wins. It's go time.
Alright, let's push on through. This player appears to be ready once again.
Let's do this.
Whether or not they'll play Falk again, we don't know, but given their apparent playstyle, no matter which character they switch to will probably have something useful to say and probably something useful to pick up, knowledge-wise. So far I've seen two things in this data collection have made me think of changes I can make to the bot, though the bot turned out a lot more complicated than I was hoping it would. It's not terribly difficult to input, thankfully, but it is complicated. You have to understand a lot of different bot theory. But in this case we get Rainbow Mika, which is a much easier to understand matchup from Luke's side because Luke basically fights Mika the same way Kali fights Mika. With almost all of the same tools as well. The thing that's going to be really important in this matchup for Luke though is the V-shift once again.
Round one.
One can't really count on the idea that you're going to be able to use Sandblaster in this matchup as a serious tool. But you can already see the particular spacings being used here. Some backdash spacings work out well, etc. In general, what you all may know from dealing with our Mika player, you can absolutely time that so that your opponent can do very little about it. The main difference is that because of the way Luke's uppercut works, you can't necessarily get a Mika player to stand far enough away. And this is one of those few cases where just doing Luke's rushing punches forward, especially with medium punch, is just a standard natural tactic in neutral. Mika can absolutely counter them, but you don't care if she counters them. Most of the time, it's making her think about the fact that she has to counter them that's important. It lets Luke maintain a spacing that would otherwise be dangerous. And adds to the whole capacity for the backdash game. You can already see one of the weaknesses of this character. There are certain jumps where a Shoto's uppercut would definitely catch you, but even Luke's lighter uppercut becomes a little bit tricky. In fact, this is probably why he has air invincibility on all of the uppercuts, similar to Sagat, because the forward movement of the move is enough that you can be messed up if you're trying to use the EX one. So you're going to have to defend yourself from jumping opponents with the light one in those scenarios. But you can see right here why it's going to be so important to actually hit, and sometimes rapidly hit, that medium punch version of... I actually don't remember the name of the move and I probably should have learned it. The answer to which way to block in that situation is neither you jump forward over Mika's head. It doesn't always work, but it's better than nothing. And as mentioned before, it's going to be an issue of specifically that. The useful thing about Luke's uppercut going so far forward is that if you do learn to back V shift into uppercut, you're much more likely to be successful in many more situations. So you end up spending a lot more meter to do things, but it's not as bad as it probably feels. From the Mika side, changing the game plan too much isn't necessarily going to help. Luke has too many counters to specific things she does. But you notice that part of the reason why this is lost is because our Mika player ends up sitting on meter. So she always has the capacity to win this. The question is whether or not you can get into a good enough position to actually use all the meter to do it.
Round one. Fight.
Keeping things mixed up well enough is probably your best option. And, as you've just seen, using the mic correctly, because you can make Luke use up a lot of energy for very little profit, let's say, by timing the move correctly. Similar to the Akuma matchup where just understanding the spacing will save you. But that's probably the more potent answer. When this character has enough meter, she can just ignore things Luke does. And simply the fact that she can do that causes Luke players' game plan to change, I would bet at this point. I'm not absolutely sure because there are still some other things he could do. For example, there might be better options for conversions and similar if using a different V skill or V trigger. But I really feel as if the Mika, this particular Mika, definitely would just change the way they were doing things. From Luke's side though, it's usually in your best interest to just let her make you use up the meter, because anything else is changing the situation in a way you probably won't like. You're probably looking for ways to keep some of it without putting yourself in too much stress, but yeah, let her make you use it up. Sometimes it's fine. And there's your reasoning for why you jump. That jump in particular didn't work, but it actually can also fail the same way if you jump forward, depends on things.
Now I beat ya.
Final round. Fight.
Learning to counter that move is a long process. Ooh, bad call, but still could have gone the other way anyway. Unfortunately, not enough health to make the whole I'm just not going to be on the ground work.
Mika wins.
And unfortunately, it looks like the president didn't get to stick around long enough to get their own matches. Now this is a complex matchup. This is even more complex matchup if the Ibuki's style of play involves using a lot of V-skill. It's not usually as bad if Nakali is using V-skill 1, but V-skill 2 Nakali has to do a lot of thinking in this matchup. Because the amount of time it takes to put a crawling beast down is enough time to do a bunch of stuff with kunai, and the caltrops are just straight up a shield against the crawling beast in the first place. But this isn't necessarily caltrops only. Her other V-skill does pretty much as good a job. The solution is once again more or less the same. There's a neutral jump timing in here.
Round 2. Fight.
And a forward jump timing that closely matches the Mika one. The main difference is that 1, neutral is harder, and 2, Nakali gets back the advantage that is normally available. I have hit you after you did things, and now you are not in a range where you are a threat to me. Or at least not a meaningful one. Barely made it. Crosscut super for the window. And again, it doesn't really matter that that was used up. Nakali builds meter fairly quickly in these situations, and doesn't use it for pretty much anything. Really good dive there. You can watch this interaction play out fairly often. Nakali hits a couple buttons, the opponent blocks them, and Nakali is therefore not in danger. This time though, big conversions. And B-shift doesn't work on that move.
Ibuki wins.
So while that was fairly explosive, it was also pretty good on both ends.
Round one.
Our Ibuki player is sticking to their plans overall. And not overcommitting when they find themselves in exactly this space, which is good, because that's generally what you want to do. Necalli has put you in a position that favors Necalli. You don't have to really do anything though. It's similar to Urien, but Necalli just does it better. Eventually, a point will happen where Necalli is not going to benefit from trying to hit more buttons. You're just going to block them, or Necalli has to jump. And since she can deal with Necalli jumping, she just can't deal with Necalli if she tries to do things. The easy answer is to just, okay, you have put me here, we're going to sit here for a bit, now what? Since most players can actually beat the opening dagger, there's not a whole lot for Necalli to do in that position. One of the better options is technically to backdash and take control of the situation in some other way, or, if you're just in the mood to go ham, actually use the meter for something. But that's the goal. By being put into that position, our Ibuki has made Necalli have to consider, am I going to use meter to try to get advantage here? Or am I going to let this go back to neutral? Because once the meter is used, the explosive damage that may often be required to win is gone. And the situation as mentioned before, the crawling beast mostly just gives Ibuki chance to charge kunai. And EX kunai is not exactly helpful. Necalli is not entirely without options here, but they require quite a bit of patience. Fortunately, we did see that patience. And the opening dagger did work. Now what made them think to do that? Good shield. And the unexpected.
Ibuki wins.
With no immediate options, overall a good match results.
Let's do this.
I've not seen this matchup in a really long while. The interactions between these two characters' moves make things interesting to scheme or strategize about. Fault can't really stop Juri from charging her V-skill, and that's usually a relatively large problem. But Juri can't just get in either, and just using it because she has it charged is insufficient. So the match ends up either being very explosive or very sedate.
Round one.
It looks like we're looking for explosive, simply because, as noted, Falk has to play more aggressively, simply because Juri could charge her V-skill and use it at basically any time to get relatively large advantages. She doesn't even have to charge it, she's just equally annoying by just using it naturally. This is compounded by the amount of time it takes for any of Falk's attacks to actually charge up to be done. She's able to use that to her advantage most of the time, but this is not a matchup where that's true. Spacing was good though, barely evaded it. And I'm not sure that the Juri player had time to walk forward enough to make it so that they would have hit. In fact, most of what we're seeing here is simply the fact that our Falk player is able to get away with jumping more than they probably would otherwise. You can do instant forward jump air throw against that style of jump and it just work, I believe. I don't think Juri's is so different from Chun's that it won't. Since none of Falk's EX moves help basically at all, when Juri chooses to charge her V-skill, this player could probably get away with it a little bit more. But this is a matter of changing your mindset rapidly, realizing I've been put into a situation where my opponent is about to try to retreat. Therefore, because they're in that retreating mindset, I can get away. They're not thinking about how to counter me if I do this, they're thinking about how to get out of the range. That situation, on the other hand, doesn't work as well, because they're basically sitting over there waiting for you to do it, which is quite different in terms of how long it will take them to react to it happening. In fact, you could often manage to do it even at ranges like that one if you thought your opponent was going to retreat. This is a very important thing to learn as a generality. You can be very relatively close and neutral, but as long as you're reasonably sure your opponent wants to get away from you, you have a lot of time. This is compounded by the fact that once Juri does have active V trigger, Falk's life is even harder.
Round two. Fight.
But in the end, I'd probably say that this matchup is almost entirely a matter of, hey, can I anti-air? Since almost all of the Falk player's damage has come from, I'm jumping now and you're not going to do anything about it.
Falk wins.
We are basically at the end of our stream though, so this is probably the last on-stream match of the night, and our last Luke data for the night.
Let's do this.
As of now, I've basically concluded that I need to change around 2 enders so that Luke is more likely to do a specific thing when under pressure and a different thing when at long ranges. Whether or not I can get all the rest of that to work with the timing I've put in for the EX version of Sandblaster is a different question, but it means that the prototype won't be available tonight. Possibly not until Wednesday night. That said, the amount of time available and the overall progress made so far means we're likely to see a standard release of the bot's Disc Guidance segment on Friday, and the release of the bot itself on our usual Sunday timing. And I got what I was hoping for, the final look at the Mika-Luke matchup. Because, as noted, Luke doesn't really have an answer to Mika charging, but there isn't anything about Mika's V trigger that is terribly threatening to this character when he's not already low on health. The interaction of constantly throwing Sandblaster at Mika's mic charge is probably just fine. Good call there on their end. If there is one thing I expect Luke players to spend a lot of time working on, it's going to be that. Making sure that they can V-shift into other moves.
Round 2. Fight.
Ooh, slightly early there. And unfortunately, even with all that used with Luke's health, I'm not sure this finishes. Nope. And that is a matter of forcing the opponent into the defensive mindset and then going for it. The higher level your opponent, the less likely that is to work. But if you've got nothing else, sometimes you've got nothing else. That's what you do. This character is not exactly bristling with long-range mix-ups.
Round 1. Fight.
There you see the purpose of those moves. You would think that one was trying to hit with them, but you're generally not. You are mostly using them to cover space where your opponent can't be sure whether or not they should counterattack yet.
Round 2. Fight.
the ability to charge them, or not charge them, is a great help in this matter. And it helps out more because anyone who's played enough in the silver ranks knows you're going to have a lot of opponents who spend most of their time trying to get out of the way. They don't actually try to get closer for fighting. This player is not really that style, but because of the ranges that it benefits them to be at, it can often look that way.
Mika wins. Round one. Fight.
As you can see, it also helps that Luke leans back quite a lot. Oh! They had that one too, huh? Just the cost to meet her? Probably not quite worth it, but
Round two. Fight.
we are going all out for the final match after all. I could definitely see this working out much more strongly with more combo theory available. But the instincts being used to play this character don't quite match up this character.
Final round.
So I'm not expecting to see a lot of Luke play in the future from our rabbit, simply because even though it is Street Fighter and not Melty Blood, even though the differences are just right in terms of making sure that the character is able to do things that are relevant to Street Fighter, the interactions don't really help. One could eventually teach oneself to like always do light uppercut for main situations or charge certain moves instead of others, but in the end those things are going to come down to practice, and on 2 hours of practice that ain't happening. But a sufficiently flashy finish. The lounge will stay open for a bit longer, but whether or not there will actually be anyone in it playing very seriously is hard to say.
Mika wins.
Similarly, I can't really assure you that there will be any other content this week other than this guidance on Friday, so tune in for that. But other than that, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK collecting loot data. Good luck with your own training and good night everyone.